you later. US President Donald Trump says very good things are happening in talks aimed at ending Russia's war in Ukraine. He made the remarks following US-brokered talks between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators held in Abu Dhabi last weekend. Meanwhile, according to reports, Washington has told Kyiv that US security guarantees would depend on Ukraine signing a peace deal with Moscow. Those guarantees are seen by Ukraine as crucial to ending the nearly 4-year war. Ukraine insists any deal must respect its territorial integrity, while Russia says territory remains a central issue. Another round of talks is expected on the 1st of February with possible US participation. We are now being joined again by Dr. Pansara Amasanghi. Thank you for joining us back here. So, with continued Russian drone and missile strikes, despite all of these diplomatic efforts, how realistic do you think it is to expect meaningful progress in peace talks when violence on the ground is still persisting?
Well, in the aftermath of the Abu Dhabi, the talks between Trump, Russians, and also Ukrainians, it is not far from obvious the United States security guarantee are considered by Ukraine as the linchpin to reach any dispute settlement with Russian Federation. But when you look at the recent statement coming from Washington, D.C., it becomes obvious very much Americans are expecting to initiate peace deal by force. So what does it mean? So there's an implicit reference which clearly urges Kiev to withdraw their forces from Donbass. As you know, 90% of Donbass region has been occupied by Russian forces by now. And if you go with Trump's deal, there is a kind of a implicit pressure upon Ukraine to accept Russia's incursion into Donbass, which is not something compatible with Kiev, because as you clearly stated in your statement, right, territory remains the core issue for Kiev. The Ukrainians are not willing to make any move with their territorial claim, and simultaneously, if you look at the Moscow's position, yes, the Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson from Kremlin, has recently stated that they would not compromise with leaving the territories which are already under the occupation of Russian forces. So territory remains the core issue for this problem. And I don't think so pushing Ukraine for a peace deal at the moment would reach an amicable solution in the long run.
And you just touched on it there. If US security guarantees on Ukraine signing this peace deal with Russia, how could that affect Ukraine's bargaining position to protect its state territory?
Well, I think that's a pretty good observation. The Ukraine's bargaining position is always based on the initial faith which they had towards the West. Because when the conflict started almost 4 years ago, I would say that Zelensky and his policymakers in Kiev expected that West would somehow protect them. And initially, Ukraine was expecting Tomahawk missiles from DC, and they thought that they would be annexed. They would be given membership to either NATO or European Union. But none of those expectations were fulfilled. So the bargaining position has come to a pretty awful stage. At the same time, you should not forget the deteriorating relationship between President Donald Trump and NATO and also European Union. So there is an article called Article 6 in NATO, which clearly affirms if one member state gets invaded or attacked by an outside party, which would be regarded as a collective invasion. But you can clearly see the rhetoric coming from Washington, D.C. nowadays, in which Trump has suggested that they're not, and he's not willing to commit too much towards continental integration or NATO security, which further demeans Ukrainians' position to sustain their own sovereign rights. And I would say that we have come to the most decadent stage of transatlantic affairs after the establishment of NATO in 1949.
And how realistic do you think it is to expect Russia and Ukraine, with both deeply opposing goals, to reach a long-lasting settlement?
I think it all depends on leveraging one's position and reducing one's expectations in return. But when you look at the facts on the ground, you might have observed since President Trump stepped into Oval Office, his stances towards Ukraine have not been something much more static. While engaging in the peace deal, he seemed to have approached Russia. And I don't think so from Putin's side that Moscow is willing to step back at least 1 inch from their expectations. And even by any chance, if both nations would reach a settlement under the supervision of President Donald Trump, I would see whatever the outcome which may emerge after the negotiation will be a greater benefit for the Russian Federation. Even after fighting for 4 years, right? You need to understand that they have not been able to occupy whole Ukraine. Only Donbas and certain provinces are under the occupation of Russian forces. And if they come to a settlement after this, if they come to a permanent solution after this settlement, that would be a strategic victory for Moscow, but not for Kiev, because under the present circumstances, I don't find any possible avenue for Kiev to leverage their position.
How long, roughly, do you think we are away from a settlement between both parties?
I beg your pardon?
How far do you think we are from a settlement to be raised? So, as Donald Trump says that they're going good, how long do we actually expect it's going to be until a peace deal is signed?
I think, if I put a little bit of dark humor, Donald Trump's statements, which means going good, can be something very much humorous, not going too good. It can be going bad as well. Because when you look at what happened in Gaza, if you compare the situation in Gaza with Ukraine, it's a crystal clear fact that what Trump initiated in Gaza too has not been completely implemented. Gaza remains a mess, the body of the peace members there. So we should not be too optimistic about the deadlines or the mechanism to intensify the peace deal between Kiev and Moscow. But I can tell you one thing before I wind up the statement. If Kiev is not willing to compromise, if Kiev is not willing to enter into the peace deal, of course there would be consequences which can be definitely awful for Ukraine in terms of their sovereignty, because Donald Trump himself has clearly stated that they would not provide Tomahawk missiles, they would not provide any security guarantee to Ukraine. So the sovereignty practically depends on a major security protection comes from Washington, D.C., because they can't totally rely on the European allies.
Thank you so much.